please welcome Professor Philip Cafaro.
Good evening, everyone. Can you hear me in the back?
Yes, sir.
Okay. How about back there?
Yes.
Great.
We don't want to listen.
What's that? Well, I'd like to begin by thanking John Andrews for his invitation and everyone here at CCU who is helping to put this on tonight. I'd like to thank Robert Zubrin for suggesting this debate, and I'd like to thank you all for coming out here tonight. I look forward to hearing your ideas about population growth and climate change a little later in the evening. This is really a three-part resolution. Next slide. First, to help slow global climate change, the U.S. should cut back sharply on greenhouse gas emissions in order to do our part to help slow global climate change. Next slide. 2, we should reduce immigration and stabilize our population. Next slide. 3, there's a connection between doing the latter and doing the former. Now, I intend to defend this resolution in its entirety tonight, but before I begin, I'd like to point out that you can agree with me on part of this without agreeing on all of it. For example, even if you disagree with me regarding climate change, and I get a sense that maybe some of you might from having talked to some of you before we started here, you still might believe that we should reduce immigration. Legal immigration into the U.S. is currently running at about 1.25 million people annually. That's the highest rate in our nation's history. Next slide, please. So here you have immigration into the U.S. by decade, starting from the 1860s up to the most recent decade. And as you can see, the past decade, 2001 to 2010, had the highest immigration in U.S. history. With over 22 million Americans unemployed or underemployed today, reducing immigration could free up jobs for our fellow citizens who really need them. So I think there's a good argument there that has nothing to do with environmental issues or climate change for reducing immigration. Similarly, even if you dislike the idea of reducing immigration, you might still see a moral imperative for the U.S. to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions due to the danger climate change poses to the poor and to future generations. Next slide, please. So according to their website, quote, the Evangelical Climate Initiative is a group of over 300 senior evangelical leaders in the U.S. who are convinced it is time for our country to help solve the problem of global warming. Our deep commitment to Jesus Christ and his commands to love our neighbors, care for the least of these, and be proper stewards of his creation compels us to act, unquote. The Evangelical Climate Initiative proposes a number of concrete, free market-friendly steps to reduce U.S. greenhouse gas emissions, and none of these have anything to do with population policy. Again, you can agree with me on immigration reduction, you can agree with me on climate change, or you can agree with me on both. And I hope you will come to agree with me that we should act in on both of these issues, and that there's a connection between them. Immigration-driven population growth has significantly increased U.S. greenhouse gas emissions in recent decades. And failure to stabilize our population is likely to undermine our efforts to do our part to limit global climate change in the future. So again, I will be focusing on that connection tonight, and I'm going to defend the resolution as stated. Next slide. I'll begin with some remarks on climate change, defending the positions that global climate change is happening, that it's being caused primarily by people, that it is a threat to human flourishing, and especially to the well-being of future generations, and that we therefore have a moral responsibility to act to limit it. In the second half of these opening remarks, I'll discuss the role population growth plays in increasing greenhouse gas emissions and the role immigration plays in driving U.S. population growth. So first then, let's talk about climate change relatively briefly. Next slide, please. Climate change is happening, as we can see from a variety of measurements and changes to the landscape. One of these is just direct measurements of temperature. So what we have here is temperature graphed per decade, taking the average, that line in the center, here as the average temperature globally, average annual temperature, and then you can see either for each decade it's lower than the average from 1900 to 2000 or higher. And as you can see, over the past 3 decades especially, temperature has been going up. Next slide, please. But that's just one aspect of this. There's actually massive evidence from many different areas of science that we're warming the climate. We have measurements of temperature on land. That's what we saw previously. We have measures of ocean temperature. That's increasing. We have evidence that glaciers are shrinking. We have evidence that sea level is rising. The warmer water gets, the more the volume it takes up, sea level's rising. We have evidence that spring is coming in earlier, some of which we've seen in Colorado in recent years. We have, well, hard to believe, okay. It varies from year to year. Did I just lose the debate right there?
My mom used to say, they're not laughing at you, they're laughing with you. You're doing fine.
Okay, that's good. We have evidence that Arctic sea ice is decreasing. And again, could we just go back to the previous slide briefly? Again, this is decadal average temperatures. And as you can see, over the past 130 years or so, on average, per decade, the temperature has increased by about 1.5 degrees Celsius. Okay. Next slide, please. So we have good evidence that human beings are warming the climate. Climate change is being caused by us, primarily through increased fossil fuel use. Next slide, please. So it's really kind of a simple story. We're putting more carbon into the air, and that carbon is heating up the planet. Estimates are that if we double pre-industrial CO2 concentrations, that would be the equivalent of placing a lit 4-watt bulb on every square meter of the Earth's land surface. Next slide, please. So here we have a graph of global fossil fuel, fossil carbon emissions. You can see that especially starting in 1900, this just exploded from maybe about 500 million tons annually to 500 billion tons annually to about 7,000 billion tons annually today. Tremendous increase. Next slide. And this now is a slide of carbon, measured carbon in the atmosphere. So we have measurements of how much carbon we've been emitting. That's increased. And now we see that over the past 5 or 6 decades, the amount of carbon that we're measuring in the atmosphere is also increasing. So it makes sense to say that there's a connection there. It's likely that this increased carbon will increase things considerably if we keep on the way we have them. Next slide. So there's a little bit of uncertainty about how much warmer things could get. But if you look at, let's say, a moderate business as usual emissions regime over the next 40 or 50, 60 years, you might see something on the order of a 2 degree to a 5 degree Celsius increase globally around the world. And of course that's going to impact different places differently. In North America, we might see a warming of 3 degrees to 6 degrees centigrade. It could go a lot higher than that if we have more people, if the economy booms, and if we keep on emitting as we have. So that's what we're doing. We're emitting carbon, we're warming the Earth, we're on a path to do more of that. Why is that a problem? I mean, maybe it's not in some places for some people, but in general, climate change is a threat to human flourishing and the well-being of life on Earth. Next slide.